It can be difficult to succeed in the wrestling business if you have a parent who is already successful in it. Not because this makes it harder to get a foot in the door, of course. No, it's because you now have to live up to their legacy. And this is sometimes impossible to do, as can be seen in cases such as David Flair, David Sammartino, and Erik Watts. On occasion, though, a performer not only matches up to their parents' high standard, but they exceed them. But just who are the most notable examples of sons and daughters that surpass their parents' success in wrestling? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with our first subject, Randy Orton. Yes, Cowboy Bob Orton certainly had his successes throughout his career during the 70s and 80s. Hell, at one point, he even became a territorial champion when he won the NWA Florida heavyweight title. And after that, he found himself getting involved in the first ever WrestleMania main event as a cornerman to Rowdy Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff. That said, all of his achievements in the industry pale in comparison to what his son would later do, because when he came along during the early 2000s, it wasn't long before he'd become among the biggest stars in the entire industry. How would Randy do this? Well, by winning the World Heavyweight title when he was still just 24 for one, an achievement which makes him the youngest world champion in WWE history. And that's far from the end of the Viper's accomplishments over the years, as since then, he's won the world title a further 13 times, all while he's been putting out some of the most classic moments in WWE history along the way. Obviously then, for as great as his dad was, this puts him in an entirely different league, as at no point could Bob Orton ever call himself the guy in WWE. But there are certainly times you could argue Randy was in this spot. Honestly, if we're talking about wrestlers who outshone their parents, then some would argue that this is the best example of such a thing happening. That said, there are others who would disagree with such an assessment, as they would instead argue the title of the best second-generation star deserves to go to our next subject, Bret Hart. Why does Bret Hart deserve this spot in some people's eyes? Well, because he's one of the greatest to ever do it, arguably the greatest in fact. Yes, in the annals of all-time greats of wrestling, he's absolutely on that short list. Not that his father was any slouch in that department either, though. No, quite the opposite, as Stu Hart, the patriarch of the Hart clan, has long been considered one of the industry's greatest legends. And he gained such a status by not only being an excellent wrestler, but also by being an excellent promoter, someone good enough to run Stampede Wrestling in Calgary for several decades. That said, for as much of a legend as this made Stu, when compared to his son, he still falls short, as need we remind you, we're talking about the excellence of execution here. 7-time world champion, multiple-time Hall of Famer, and someone who has numerous claims for best match ever with his bouts against opponents such as Stone Cold Steve Austin, Mr. Perfect, and his late brother, Owen Hart. Really, the resume speaks for itself, and it tells the story of someone who was so good at what they did, they were even able to outshine one of the most important figures of the territorial era. Of course, given how hard Stu trained his kids in the Hart Dungeon and how much he demanded the best of them, we're sure he'd be proud to know that most think of his son as having outshone him now. But what of someone else we mentioned a moment ago, a certain Perfect superstar? Surely they deserve to be mentioned too. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the legend that is Mr. Perfect. That's right, Curt Henning had a father who was in the industry too, although he never got a chance to get his moment of mainstream success in WWF. But don't let this fool you into thinking Larry the Axe Henning wasn't a legend in his own right, as he most certainly was. Hell, during the 60s and 70s, he was one of the American Wrestling Association's most dependable and popular figures, and this was exactly why he'd become a tag team champion on 5 separate occasions while there. Of course, while this might solidify him as a great, it doesn't solidify him as being perfect. No, if you want to find perfection in the Henning family, then you have to look to his son. And that's because even before he took up the mantle of Mr. Perfect in WWF, Curt Hennig was finding success in the AWA as a one-time world champion. But he wasn't happy to just leave things there. Rather, this was just the start of what the Minnesota native had planned, as after conquering Vern Gagne's promotion, he'd sign on the dotted line with Vince McMahon and would there morph into his most popular incarnation. And it was while in this incarnation that he became a true superstar and someone who could always be relied upon to steal the show anytime he was asked to lace up his boots. Hell, this was exactly why he became a 2-time Intercontinental Champion back during a period when being IC Champ meant the most. And it's exactly why he was the one trusted with getting Bret Hart over to the next level during the early 90s. No, he never did win the big one in the WWF, but then very few people did during the 80s, as that was the era of Hulkamania's complete and total dominance. So Kurt never holding the winged eagle shouldn't be considered any slight on his talents. And it's not like he wasn't a world champion elsewhere anyway, as his time on top in the AWA showed, with this being something his father never managed to achieve. Again though, like with Stu Hart, we're pretty sure Larry Henning would have been proud to see his son outshine him, as it's what any good father wants of their children. It's certainly what Rick Steiner wanted for our next subject, Braun Breaker. Okay, we know it might seem a little bit premature to call Braun Breaker better than his father as he's still so early into his career, but come on, he's already outshone him in so many ways. Sure, if we're talking about his uncle Scott, then things might be different, as he was a multiple-time world champion as a singles performer, and at points, one of the most over men in the entire industry. But when it comes to Rick, that was never really the case. Not that he wasn't great, of course, it's just that when it came to the dog-faced gremlin, he always excelled as part of a duo and never so much by going solo. Sure, he would become a tag team champion countless times, and this is certainly not an achievement to be sniffed at. But if you asked him to stand on his own 2 feet without the help of his brother, then this was where he would falter somewhat. When it comes to his son Braun though, that doesn't seem to be a problem, as while he has found success as part of a tag team with Baron Corbin already, he's found just as much success as a singles act. Hell, he's already a 2-time NXT World Champion, and he's still only 26 years old. And in terms of main roster achievements, he's now a 1-time Intercontinental Champion after defeating Sami Zayn at SummerSlam. But that's likely only going to be the beginning of his reign of dominance, as after that we wouldn't be surprised to see him win either the World Heavyweight title or the WWE title before the decade is out. Really, it's just a matter of letting this one play out, as we can't imagine anything other than a catastrophic injury stopping the Georgia native. Who knows, by the time all is said and done, he might not only have outshone his father Rick, but his uncle Scott too. Honestly, Braun Breaker is a performer so special that he could be the face of the company at a certain point if things work out in his favor. And that's something you could have never said about either of the Steiner brothers, even when they were at their peaks. But let's move away from the men for a moment, because it's not only sons who have outshone their fathers in the wrestling industry. No, sometimes daughters have done the same. And one of the most prominent examples of this can be found in our next subject, Carmella. Yes, current-day fans of WWE all know who Carmella is, 1-time SmackDown Women's Champion, 1-time Women's Tag Team Champion, and the 2017 Money in the Bank winner. What many fans may not know, though, is that before she ever stepped foot inside of a WWE ring, her father was doing the same thing. Sure, this hasn't been as heavily publicized as some other examples we've looked at today, as Paul Van Dale was never treated like a star in WWF. Rather, he was more of a journeyman wrestler who went from place to place and could be usually relied upon to put other, more established stars over. Of course, when it came to his daughter Leah, though, she was never going to be happy with such limitations being attached to her. And that was exactly why, when she joined WWE in 2013, she made her intentions clear. And those intentions were for her to be a star on a level that her father had never been able to achieve. Would she manage to do this? Well, you only need to watch any of her work to know that she did, as there have been points where she's been one of the biggest names in the entire division. Again, this is a former women's champion we're talking about here, and someone who not only holds the honor of being a former Miss Money in the Bank, but being the first ever Miss Money in the Bank. Not an achievement that should be taken lightly. So to say she hasn't outshone her dad at this point would be untrue. And this isn't the only example of a woman on the current-day WWE roster outshining her father, as the same thing could be said about our next subject too, Raquel Rodriguez. Yes, like with Carmella, Raquel Rodriguez's lineage in the wrestling industry isn't necessarily on the same level of something like the Hart family or the Orton clan. Rather, her dad was Ricky Desperado Gonzalez, someone who was less of a superstar in his own right and more of a journeyman performer who worked with the stars and helped to put them over. Again though, like with Carmella, when Raquel Rodriguez joined WWE in 2016 after a successful run as a college basketball player, she quickly made it her aim to become more than her father had been by becoming a true superstar in her own right. And this was something she was able to make major headway with almost immediately, as during her time down in NXT, she'd not only become a 2-time tag team champion, but a 1-time world champion too. Sure, she's yet to win any singles gold on the main roster, but with her still only being 33, there's plenty of time for her to achieve that yet. And when she does achieve this, she'll have truly outshone her father, as for as reliable as Ricky Gonzalez was, titles were never going to be a thing on his radar. But again, we have to imagine seeing his daughter succeed in a way he never did must make him incredibly proud, as he can look upon her as being his real legacy in the industry. Who knows, this legacy might even be so bright by the end of things that we're talking about the Rodriguez dynasty becoming a thing, as there's really no limit on what Raquel can achieve if she puts her mind to it. She certainly has all the physical skills required, and fans have generally taken to her as a star ever since she joined the main roster in 2023. We guess we'll have to wait and see how this one plays out, as there's no telling what new wrinkles will be added to her story in the years to come. One story we don't have to wait and see play out though, because it's already been told, is that of our next subject, another performer who outshone his famous dad, Macho Man Randy Savage. Come on now, how could we not include this one? After all, when you think of the biggest stars of 1980s wrestling, you have to think about the Macho Man. And that's because during the first boom period of the industry, there were very few who could match up to his level of charisma. Really, we're talking about Hulk Hogan, and that's it. Obviously though, Randy wouldn't be the first member of his family to break out in the wrestling industry, as years before he was ever a thing, his father Angelo Poffo was making major headway as a legend of the territories. And this headway saw him not only hold gold in multiple different places, but also run his own territory, International Championship Wrestling, in Kentucky. That said, for as great as these achievements are, none of them can hold a candle to what the Macho Man would later achieve, because after signing with WWF in 1985, he'd quickly rise up the ranks to become one of the promotion's top stars. And the way he did this was not only by having one of the most engaging characters of all time, but also by proving his ability to steal the show in the ring on any given night. So good was he, in fact, even during an era which was dominated by Hulk Hogan, Randy would find himself holding the WWF title on 2 separate occasions. And when he wasn't doing that, he was holding other prized possessions, such as the Intercontinental title, that are becoming King of the Ring back during a time when that contest was still being held on the house show circuit. Really, it's hard to think of something the Ohio native didn't do during his career. And it's hard not to put him on that Mount Rushmore of great performers who came out of the 80s either. So for this reason then, he's clearly overshadowed his father historically. And considering Angelo Poffo was a pretty big deal in his own right back in the day, that's an impressive achievement and a testament to just how one-of-a-kind the Macho Man was. But Randy Savage isn't the only legend of WWE who outshone his famous promoter father. No, as we've already seen, people like Bret Hart did this too, and another who did exactly the same thing is our next subject, Jeff Jarrett. That's right, back during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Jerry Jarrett was one of the most popular figures of the territories. And this wasn't just because of his work in the ring. No, it was also because of his work as a promoter, as he was a founder and owner of the legendary Continental Wrestling Association, better known by its shorthand title, Memphis Wrestling. Yes, the promotion that gave us such things as the rise of Jerry Lawler and the introduction to the wrestling world for Andy Kaufman was the brainchild of the Nashville native, and this understandably makes him a major figure in wrestling history. But for as important as Jerry Jarrett was, when his son came of age during the 90s, he still somehow managed to overshadow him. Why was that? Well, because his son was Jeff Jarrett, 12-time world champion and multiple-time Hall of Famer. Someone so good that even now, 5 decades into his career, he's still somehow managed to remain relevant by becoming one of the breakout sympathetic babyfaces of AEW in recent weeks. But then this shouldn't come as a surprise to those who have followed his career, as he's always been able to command audiences' attention, whether that be inside of the ring or outside of it. That's right, aside from being a legend between the ropes, Jeff Jarrett has also followed his father's footsteps by entering into the promotion game too. And this was what led to him forming TNA in 2002 following the death of WCW, with this being a promotion that, against all odds, still somehow exists today. In fact, you could argue that setting aside all the title wins and all the classic moments, it's the continued success of Impact which represents the Last Outlaw's real legacy. A legacy which has by now arguably even outshone what his father had been able to do during his lifetime. But you don't always have to overshadow a promoter father in order to be great. Now, as we've seen, sometimes just outshining a dad who's a wrestler is enough to make someone a legend, and that's a statement that can certainly apply to our next subject, The Rock. Yes, we know there are many other reasons why The Rock is a legend. After all, he's one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, arguably only behind Hulk Hogan and Steve Austin, and he's also one of the top draws in all of Hollywood. But even if he wasn't a big deal in movies, he'd likely still have outshone his dad, as before he even dipped his toes into the world of the silver screen, he was clearly a megastar. Sure, Rocky Johnson was no slouch in this department either. No, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in fact, he made quite a name for himself as one of the top territory guys out there. Hell, this was exactly what led to him becoming one half of the first ever African-American WWF Tag Team Champions alongside Tony Atlas in 1983. But come on now, the Soul Man could have been a world champion multiple times over, and he still wouldn't be in the same stratosphere as his son. And that's because, as we mentioned a moment ago, Dwayne Johnson is one of the biggest stars the wrestling industry has ever produced. Someone so colossally charismatic and synonymous with the squared circle that he's often the first name which will come to people's minds when they're asked to think of a wrestler. Seriously, how could anyone compete with this? And so it's simply a no-brainer then that the People's Champion would be given a spot in today's video. Yes, even if we take his movie work out of the equation, in the ring alone, he's reached levels that very few others have come close to reaching. Who else can say that they were briefly the face of the WWF during its most popular mainstream period, is a former 10-time world champion, and currently sits on the board of TKO? But what about our next subject, this being none other than Bray Wyatt? That's right, in recent decades, there have been few performers who captured fans' attention in the way he did with his cinematic characters and out-there style of performances. So good was Bray, in fact, it's easy to forget that he wasn't the first person in his family to hit it big in wrestling, as his dad was none other than Mike Rotunda, better known to most fans as Irwin R. Shyster. That's right, during the latter days of the Golden Era, IRS was one of the top heel acts in WWF. But it wasn't just working as a heel where Rotunda excelled, as prior to that he'd been an excellent babyface tag team act as part of the Varsity Club. That said, for as great as he was, no matter what role he was asked to play, pretty much everyone will agree at this point that his son would far exceed him in every area once he came along during the mid-2010s. Why is this? Well, because Bray had a unique ability to create characters which completely captivated audiences in a way no one else around him was doing at the time. And whenever one of those characters was a casualty of bad booking, he had the ability to just reinvent himself with something new. That's how, over the course of his ultimately short career, he was able to give us such creations as the Bayou Cult Leader, The Fiend, and Uncle Howdy. Of course, following his tragic death in 2023, we've all had to accept we'll not get a chance to see where Bray might have gone next. But even if his life was a brief one, he still did enough during it to solidify him as one of those rare performers who was not only able to match up to their famous parents, but actually do better than them. Could he have done even more and solidified this status even further if he'd had time? Undoubtedly he would have, but that's unfortunately not going to happen, so instead we'll have to be grateful for what we got from him while we were around. But then we should be grateful for all the performers we've discussed today, as they show that, even if you have big shoes to fill, you can still become a star in the wrestling industry.